Mary Burns had the misfortune to grow up in Manchester. Victorians thought this northern English boomtown looked like hell on earth. Amid a labyrinth of red brick textile mills erected on a filthy plain of mud, smoke belched, wheels crunched, boilers shrieked, looms thundered out a steady beat like drums of war. People called Manchester the Cottonopolis. It was the firstborn child of the Industrial Revolution, the emblem of English modernity, and perhaps the harbinger of human life to come. Mary Burns was witty, wild, and Irish. She had grown up hungry in Manchester's immigrant ghetto, where she'd heard countless people singing melancholy folk songs about homes and loved ones they had left behind. About 1 in every 4 Mancunians were either first or second generation Irish immigrants. This large, restless population competed with the English working class for jobs and wages meted out by wealthy mill owners, who used their stranglehold on power to stoke ethnic tensions while they dug out an ever-widening trench between the rich and poor. In her late teens, Mary found work inside Victoria Mill. Despite its patriotic name, which honored Britain's queen, Victoria was operated by a foreign corporation based in Germany. Its owners lived abroad, but they wrote fawning letters thanking British police and soldiers for repressing labor protests that broke out in Manchester in 1842. Coincidentally, 1842 was also the year when one of Victoria Mill's foreign owners sent his good-for-nothing son to England in the hopes that he would straighten out his life. A cush desk job at Daddy's firm would teach young Fred about the value of responsibility. More practically, it would keep him far away from the bad influence of all his troublemaking friends at home. We don't know how exactly Fred and Mary met or fell in love, but somehow, almost miraculously, she claimed the boss's son as her new boyfriend just a few months after he arrived in Manchester. This relationship was not what Fred's father had hoped for. His son was supposed to be maturing into someone you could introduce at dinner parties and stockholder meetings. Now, he was gallivanting around town in the arms of a wild Irish woman who was infecting him with radical ideas. Mary showed Fred around the neighborhoods where she'd grown up. She guided him through pestilential slums, held his hand as they stepped over pools of sewage, and introduced him to ex-mill workers who had been maimed and crippled in gruesome industrial accidents. Mary couldn't read or write. Fred could. He was horrified by everything she showed him, and he vowed to use his privilege to reveal how people like his father had despoiled England. Mary knew that Fred had good intentions. Still, she often bristled at his ignorance of what it really meant to live in poverty. From her perspective, he had never worked a real job in his life. He spent money like he didn't understand its value. Most offensively of all, he repeatedly offered to pay her an allowance so that she wouldn't have to work in Victoria Mill anymore. Wasn't she accepting money from his family either way, Fred asked? Why go to all the extra trouble working for it? Whether out of pride, or stubbornness, or sheer political conviction, Mary always rejected Fred's offers. She sometimes regretted that despite his radical politics, he didn't understand her values very well. Nonetheless, she loved him. He bought her a house in Manchester. Because they both agreed that marriage was a patriarchal institution that degraded women, they cohabited as an unmarried couple. Despite their lack of legal obligations to each other, they remained together until Mary passed away in 1863. Fred and Mary were like Romeo and Juliet without a tragic ending. Their story reminds us that even in the dismal world of Manchester, sympathy between the rich and poor was possible. The only problem with this story is that most of it's untrue. Almost everything that I've told you so far comes from the work of Edmund Wilson, an American biographer who wrote about Mary Burns' life nearly a century after her death. Wilson relied on deduction, guesswork, and even outright speculation to plug the gaps in her story. Unfortunately, that story is practically nothing but gaps. We don't have any record of her birth. No photograph or illustration of her has survived. Our only primary source about her life is a short reference to her death, which comes from a letter written by a devastated Fred to one of his best friends.
Mary is dead. Last night, she went to bed early, and when her sister Lizzie wanted to go to bed shortly before midnight, she found she had already died. Quite suddenly. Heart failure or an apoplectic stroke. I wasn't told till this morning. On Monday evening, she was still quite well. I simply can't convey what I feel. The poor girl loved me with all her heart.
Fred's friend barely seemed to care about his loss. In his response to Fred's letter, he insisted that the news of Mary's death surprised no less than it dismayed me. She was so good-natured, witty, and closely attached to you. Then, immediately after these kind words, he launched into a paragraph full of self-pity and requested that his grieving friend send him some money.
The devil alone knows why nothing but ill luck should dog everyone in our circle just now. I no longer know which way to turn. If I don't succeed in raising a largish sum, then the household here has barely another 2 weeks to go. It is dreadfully selfish of me to tell you about these horrors at this time. But it's a homeopathic remedy. One calamity is a distraction from the other.
The author of that letter was Karl Marx. Mary's life partner, Fred, is better known as Friedrich Engels. Together, these two men are renowned as the authors of the Communist Manifesto and the founders of Marxism, which is arguably the most significant intellectual and political mode of thought in modern world history. In this context, what are we supposed to make of the illiterate Manchester woman who opened her wealthy boyfriend's eyes to capitalism's exploitation of the working class? Without firm documentary evidence, the broad details of their romance as it's often told seem too convenient to be true. How many times have you heard this narrative before? A marginalized woman, economically poor and racially coded, welcomes a privileged man into her world. As he falls in love with her, he comes to recognize that the society to which he owes his status is unjust. After joining the woman's community, he's reborn as the leader of a downcast people, and he wages war against the world he used to rule. You'll recognize this as the plot of stories like Exodus, Dune, and Avatar. More to the point, it's also a persistent trope of Victorian-era industrial fiction, including works set in Manchester. Given that so many 19th century factory novels center on a redemptive romance between a powerful man and an impoverished woman, we need to be very careful about how we understand the narrative of Mary Burns and Friedrich Engels. If something seems too allegorical to be true, then it probably is. Even in her own time, Mary Burns was being misremembered and erased from history. For example, Eleanor Marx, Karl's daughter, described her as an Irish factory girl. This description is wrong in two ways. First, Mary was half Irish on her father's side, but her mother was English, and she spent almost her entire life in Manchester. Second, Mary probably never held a job at Victoria Mill. Although she may have worked in a different textile factory once upon a time, Engels seems to have met her only after she had quit that job and entered the domestic service industry, which was more respectable. For what it's worth, Engels' love for Mary Burns seems to have been genuine. Marx's insensitive reply to the news of her death so enraged him that the two men nearly severed ties with one another. Most scholars also feel confident that Mary influenced Engels' political orientation by showing him around Manchester's slums. Even so, the story of what Engels later called his conversion to proto-communism isn't quite as simple as the one that I've told you. When he wrote about his time in England, he didn't credit anyone specific as the source of his political awakening. Instead, he slipped into the passive voice in ways that make it hard to tell who was responsible. In Manchester, he said, it had been tangibly brought to my notice that economic facts are a decisive historical force. Who or what had brought this to his notice? Readers can only guess. Historians face two questions then. First, did Mary Burns show Friedrich Engels around Manchester? This is hard to prove, but it seems highly probable. So, Second, why didn't he credit her publicly? This is a more open-ended question. Engels never hid his love for Mary, whom he frankly called his best and oldest friend. Nevertheless, he was extremely paranoid about the optics of their romance. The heir to a wealthy factory owner was cohabiting with a working-class woman who may or may not once have been his father's employee. Their relationship's outrageous power imbalance had the potential to make Engels appear hypocritical whenever he professed his commitment to egalitarian politics. I suspect that he downplayed Mary's influence on his political awakening in order to distance the potentially controversial details of his private life from his career as a public figure. Unfortunately, we may never know the truth. After Mary's death, Engels destroyed their correspondence with each other. Nothing of it survives. Even if just a fraction of the stories about Mary Burns are true, that fraction offers an invaluable reminder that the world historic ideology of Marxism emerged from the material conditions of Victorian England. Engels cohabited with a Manchester woman for decades. Marx wrote his magnum opus, Capital, in the British Museum. Both Marx and Engels frequently alluded to English literature in their published work, and they compiled sprawling lists of economic data culled from parliamentary reports. They believed that England was a harbinger of Europe's future and the world's more generally. As they saw it, Manchester was patient zero of industrial capitalism, a disease that would someday infect the distant corners of the planet. Marx wrote that,
"If the German reader shrugs his shoulders at the condition of England, or, in the optimist fashion, comforts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not nearly so bad, I must plainly tell him, de te fabula narratur."
Or, in English, the tale is told of you. Enclosure and industrialization, the twin subjects of today's episode, are the keys to understanding the entire 19th century, and maybe everything that's happened since that time. How did these two economic processes begin? How did they proceed? And how did ordinary people actually experience them on a daily basis? My name is Brian Reinken. Welcome to Episode 5 of Melting into Air. Chapter 1. The Origins of English Capitalism. This chapter's subject matter is complex and controversial. So, naturally, I'd like to begin with a rhyme about a goose. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. This rhyme first appeared in print in 1821, but it probably circulated orally for several decades before that. We don't know who wrote it, or even whether it had a single author in the first place. In any case, The Goose in the Common expresses a spirit of popular protest that dominated the English countryside during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At that time, wealthy landowners in Parliament were conspiring to rob the poor of their ancestral rights and privileges. You would go to prison if you stole a goose, but if you stole the farm, then you would win a seat in Westminster. To fully understand the context of the goose rhyme, we need to go back several hundred years, to the period when capitalism first took root in England. Capitalism differs from all historical forms of economic exchange by promoting a specific set of social relations. Foremost among them is the drive to maximize profits by reinvesting surpluses, improving the efficiency of labor, and developing the forces of production. Imagine capitalism as the endless pursuit of limitless growth. It's an all-consuming urge to always make more profit faster than ever before. As a result of this urge, economic revolution becomes the normal condition of life. Under capitalism, you can't expect your world to look like the one that your parents knew when they were your age. You can't even expect it to look like it did a few months ago. In pre-capitalist economies, even sophisticated ones like ancient Rome's, mercantile wealth depends upon the circulation of existing products, not on the creation of new products cheaply and in bulk. Here, privileged buyers' consumption of luxury goods like silk or spices determines the most profitable trade patterns. Meanwhile, consumer spending on everyday items, such as food, remains comparatively low. Significant sectors of the pre-capitalist population can survive more or less independently of the market, as subsistence farmers. Under a capitalist economy, in contrast, all goods and services are produced for exchange, which means that the vast majority of people are obliged to sell their labor in return for wages. As workers produce goods and services, they make profit for the capitalists who buy their labor power. Ultimately, the production of goods and services becomes subordinate to the expansion of capital and the growth of profit. Although scholars debate when and where capitalism first came into being, most of them agree that it emerged in Western Europe sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries. How and why capitalism first emerged are more controversial questions. Some theorists argue that European economies became capitalist due to population growth. Others suggest that capitalism developed from the exploitation of conquered territories. Others still have claimed that capitalism's birth had something to do with Protestant ethics, technological development, or the centralization of European monarchies. There's a degree of truth to all these explanations, but none of them are totally sufficient on their own. Anyone who names a single factor as the only cause of capitalism doesn't know what they're talking about. So how did capitalism first take root in early modern England? Let's begin by imagining a pre-capitalist English village as it existed sometime around the mid-1400s. Such villages typically consisted of no more than a few hundred people. A small handful of these people, called freeholders or yeomen, owned their own land. The vast majority of villagers, however, were tenant farmers or peasants who owed rent payments in the form of labor and agricultural goods. Rent went to the lord and his family, who lived in a large manor house. They were by far the wealthiest people in the area, and they enjoyed more legal rights and privileges than commoners. The land around the village was divided into several fields. In turn, each field was divided into dozens or hundreds of different strips, producing a chaotic crisscross pattern. Many of these strips were the lord's personal property, his demesne, where tenants were legally required to spend a few days weekly growing crops that they would give to him at harvest time. Another sizable portion of the strips, the glebe, belonged to the local church. At the beginning of each agricultural season, village leaders divided all remaining strips among the local tenants, who had the right to farm them for their own subsistence. Oftentimes, the strips that any given tenant family received were scattered haphazardly across the village, not located conveniently side by side. In addition to arable farmland, every English village typically included rocky, swampy, or hilly soil that was incapable of growing food. No one did anything with this so-called wasteland, which remained uncultivated. Most villages also had a river, a forest, and a meadow. The rent that tenants paid the lord entitled them to fish in the river and hunt in the forest. Everyone in the village was also entitled to graze their animals in the meadow, which was owned in common and was therefore called the commons. If you visit the podcast's website, meltingintoair.net, you can see a diagram of the village that I've just described. Around the 16th century, England's villages began to change. Wealthy lords bought land from yeomen and freeholders, which enlarged their own estates and turned most ordinary people into tenants. Meanwhile, the English monarchy centralized power under strong rulers like Henry VIII. Kings and queens banned local lords from collecting rent in the form of goods or labor. Consequently, lords began to collect rent solely in cash. Under this system, lords who sought to maximize their wealth needed to maximize their tenants' productivity. After all, more productive tenants could pay higher rents. To that end, England's upper classes grew preoccupied with what they called improvement. This word didn't yet have moral connotations. It was just another term for profit. Landlords sought to improve their estates, that is, to make them more profitable, by adopting new agricultural technologies, rotating crops, and draining swamps. They allocated plots of farmland geometrically, not in haphazard strips. More controversially, they seized assets that had once been held in common. Tenants were deprived of their ancestral rights to hunt in woodlands and to fish in rivers. Meadows that had once belonged to the entire village were now open solely to the lord, who used them to sustain a private flock of sheep that he could shear for wool. The process of appropriating common land and revoking ancestral rights came to be known as enclosure. Often, it involved building fences or growing hedges to literally enclose and privatize the public land that everyone used to enjoy. The result was a slow, simmering class war. England's penal system expanded in proportion to the power of the country's landowners, and ever higher numbers of working-class convicts were transported overseas for crimes like hunting in the woods they'd always hunted in, or picking fruit from trees that grew in their backyards. Remember the goose rhyme I read? The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common. Over the course of 3 centuries, the members of Parliament, all of whom were wealthy landlords, passed literally thousands of enclosure acts authorizing the appropriation of common land and the abolition of common rights. Again, think back to the goose rhyme. The law leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. In other words, England's rich and powerful elites were legalizing their own crimes that Karl Marx later described as land grabbing on a great scale. Freeholders lost their property, tenants' rent increased, and ever more of England's population grew dependent on wage labor to sustain their basic needs. Many rural people were reduced to migrants, working exploitative seasonal contracts on wealthy landlords' farms. Many other country dwellers had to seek new jobs in cities, which ballooned in size. The process of enclosure reached its apex in the 18th century. By 1700, 5,000 wealthy families owned approximately half of England's land. Fully 1/4 of the country was the property of just 400 people. If you've ever read Jane Austen's novels, then you might remember touring great estates like Pemberley. You may not have realized that the cultured lifestyle of men like Mr. Darcy, men whose only worldly labor is an evening walk, depends upon the systematic exploitation of a vast tenant class that Austen barely ever tries to represent. Many privileged English writers defined manners or respectability in direct opposition to the kind of manual labor that had always been a fact of life for ordinary people. In his great book The Country and the City, published in 1973, the English literary critic Raymond Williams reflects upon gargantuan manor houses like the ones in Austen's fiction. I'll quote his words at length.
It is fashionable to admire these extraordinarily numerous houses. People still pass from village to village, guidebook in hand, to see the next and yet the next example, to look at the stones and the furniture. But stand at any point and look at that land. Look at what those fields, those streams, those woods even today produce. Think it through as labor and see how long and systematic the exploitation and seizure must have been to rear that many houses on that scale. See, by contrast, what any ancient isolated farm, in uncounted generations of labor, has managed to become by the efforts of any single real family, however prolonged. And then turn and look at what these other families, these systematic owners, have accumulated and arrogantly declared as their own. You know, looking at the land and then at the house, how much robbery and fraud there must have been for so long to produce that degree of disparity, that barbarous disproportion of scale. Manor houses are a visible stamping of power, of displayed wealth and command, a social disproportion which was meant to impress and overawe. Much of the real profit of a more modern agriculture went not into productive investment, but into that explicit social declaration of an established and commanding class power.
Not all artists were as willfully blind to the class power of enclosure as Jane Austen. In 1770, the Anglo-Irish writer William Goldsmith published his poem The Deserted Village, which evokes the gradual destruction of a rural community called Auburn. Auburn's land had once been held in common, but now, following a process of enclosure, one only master grasps the whole domain. The man of wealth and pride takes up a space that many poor supplied, space for his lake, his park's extended bounds, space for his horses, equipage, and hounds. Notwithstanding his poetry's outrage, Goldsmith has blind spots too. Despite his earnest effort to depict the desolation of the countryside, he falls back on cheap pastoralist cliches whenever he envisions rural England as it looked before enclosure. Auburn, we're told, was once a place where health and plenty cheered the laboring swain, a place defined by its dear lovely bowers of innocence and ease, and so forth. Goldsmith simply doesn't have the language to describe an unspoiled rural world authentically. It's not that he fails to recognize enclosure's exploitative history. Instead, it's that he can't access a world outside that history because he's never witnessed it firsthand. By the time when he began to write, England's pre-capitalist peasantry had all but disappeared. At the turn of the 19th century, Romantic poets responded to enclosure by seeking out exotic landscapes in the Lake District or the Scottish Highlands, where they imagined, wrongly, that people could still live traditional lifestyles. Ironically, the poets appreciated these landscapes in direct proportion to their perceived usefulness. Nature, they felt, was supposed to serve humankind by offering a reprieve from the burdens of civilization. You'll notice that this outlook doesn't differ fundamentally from that of England's improvement-obsessed landlords. Nature is still meant to be consumed. Landscapes still have quantifiable value. Wastelands are still regions to reclaim. Romantics like William Wordsworth weren't literally fencing off the commons. They recoiled at the thought of doing so. But, like Goldsmith, they struggled to think themselves out of their cultural moment. Romantic sympathy for enclosure's victims always has an element of distance to it. In poems like Michael or The Old Cumberland Beggar, Wordsworth tenderly evokes the pain that rural people feel when somebody deprives them of their land. Nonetheless, he also imagines that this class of people is inevitably doomed to go extinct. His poems suggest that although it's right and proper to shed tears over their disappearance, we shouldn't delude ourselves into believing that we have the power to prevent it. Wordsworth's acceptance of the status quo looks more conservative than we might expect from an iconoclastic writer. Maybe it's no coincidence that he eventually turned against his youthful idealism and became England's poet laureate, the mouthpiece of the country's lawmakers and landlords. With all due respect to Wordsworth, I feel strongly that any serious interpretation of enclosure needs to foreground its heinous, systemic abuse of tenants without romanticizing the conditions of life in a pre-enclosure world. To that end, I'm extremely wary of certain modern intellectuals and activists' tendency to idealize the commons as though this concept were uniformly and self-evidently redemptive. For example, one prominent scholar, whose work I otherwise admire greatly, has argued that the commons is without class struggle, and that its political basis is agape, the creative and redemptive love of justice with sacred connotations. Unfortunately, the Edenic utopia that this scholar evokes has little to no basis in historical reality. Like Goldsmith's poem The Deserted Village, its idealization of a vanished world reveals a deep naivete about what that world was really like. Life in a pre-enclosure village was certainly not defined by sacred love. It was certainly not without class struggle. Even before enclosure, the village was a deeply stratified society of lords, freeholders, tenants, and the landless poor. Royal decrees, ecclesiastical laws, manorial courts, and vigilante mobs competed to enact incompatible definitions of justice. Families nursed ancestral feuds, neighbors held grudges against each other. There's no doubt that Enclosure was systemically abusive, nor is there any doubt that it inaugurated a wholesale transformation of the English countryside. Even so, Enclosure didn't introduce class struggle where it hadn't already existed. When we think about the historic conditions of rural life, we need to find the courage to admit that there was never a Garden of Eden. This admission won't invalidate a humanistic outlook on world history. Instead, it will give that outlook intellectual heft. It's absurd to argue for a better future on the basis of a non-existent past. We must be serious people to be taken seriously. Chapter 2. The Highland Clearances. In his landmark book The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the Scottish economist Adam Smith argued that some people work harder than others. Over time, these people accumulate more property than their idle peers. By reinvesting surplus profits, they acquire ever greater wealth until, at last, a fully developed capitalist economy springs into existence almost spontaneously. Smith used the term previous accumulation to describe the prehistory of capitalism. When various European economists translated that term to German and then back to English, it acquired the name it bears today: primitive accumulation. Karl Marx found Smith's account of primitive accumulation unconvincing. During the mid-19th century, he accused it of ignoring the role that imperial violence played in the origins of capitalism.
The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production.
Marx's outraged exposé of imperial violence supplanted Smith's misty-eyed mythology of hard workers. Today, even orthodox historians of capitalism often use the term primitive accumulation in a Marxist sense to denote pre-capitalist forms of coercion, conquest, and colonization that enrich powerful states at the expense of weaker ones. Marx argued that powerful states invest their surplus wealth into the mechanisms of a capitalist economy. Eventually, they shift away from direct exploitation by means of military violence toward indirect exploitation by means like wage labor. Once a capitalist market has emerged, primitive accumulation becomes known simply as accumulation. The Marxist theory of primitive accumulation has many detractors. For what it's worth, I myself don't subscribe wholeheartedly to all its claims, but I believe it makes good points, and I think that it's the least wrong way to understand the processes it tries to analyze. As we discuss the Highland clearances throughout this chapter, I invite you to reflect upon two questions. First, were the clearances examples of imperialism? Second, how does empire relate to economics? The Gaelic language and the clan system defined traditional Scottish culture. Over the centuries, however, influence from England slowly trickled northward. In 1707, Scotland and England were united in a single kingdom of Great Britain. From that moment, Scottish cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow grew more cosmopolitan. Merchants there spoke English, and they didn't feel a strong allegiance to their clans. Cultural fantasies about authentic Scottishness proliferated, as the real thing seemed at risk of disappearing permanently. The poet Robert Burns, for instance, published in a flashy, faux Scots dialect designed for English readers. Walter Scott wrote English-language novels that romanticized a legendary Scottish past. Nationalist literature belied the fact that Scotland looked more English than ever before. Enclosure played a major role in Scotland's transformation. During the 18th century, capitalist development reduced most of the region's rural population to the status of proletarian wage earners. Some people in remote parts of the Highlands still wore traditional clothing, spoke Gaelic, and identified with clans. Even there, though, they raised cattle or harvested kelp for sale on the capitalist market. They bought manufactured goods from major cities, and they conducted trade with money, not the barter system. A Scottish peasant from the Middle Ages wouldn't recognize the lifestyle of a tenant in the 19th century. By 1800, the long process of Scottish enclosure was nearing its end, but its final and most violent phase was still to come. Improvement-obsessed landlords thought that Highland glens looked like the perfect place to raise huge, profitable flocks of sheep. The problem was that human tenants still farmed the most fertile pasture land. The challenge was how to get rid of them. Today, we'll approach that challenge in the context of the Highland estate belonging to Lady Elizabeth, the Countess of Sutherland. In 1785, she married George Levison Gower, the heir to one of England's richest families. The Countess had him wrapped around her finger, and when his father died in 1803, he inherited enough money to finance her wildest ambitions. Above all, the Countess aspired to improve and modernize her vast estate. Many of her current tenants had occupied their place of residence for multiple successive generations. They grew crops or herded cattle on the same land their great-grandparents once occupied. Although the Countess made a hefty profit off these tenants' rent, she knew that her aristocratic friends and neighbors made even more money leasing land to sheep farmers, whose business with the woolen textile industry allowed them to pay genuinely eye-popping rents in exchange for the privilege of grazing their flocks on verdant highland meadows. The Countess reasoned that evicting her current tenants and replacing them with sheep farmers was an astute financial plan. She justified this plan in moral terms by promising that she would use her money to uplift evicted tenants by resettling them on coastal regions of her property, where she would help them find new jobs. Her goal, she maintained, was to develop and enrich the local area, not just herself. It's very doubtful that the Countess actually believed what she was saying. Sutherland was geographically remote and poor in natural resources. Its tenants often starved in times of famine. Now, disturbingly, the Countess was proposing to replace people who grew food with people who sold wool. In private letters, she grumbled about what she called the superfluous population of tenant farmers, who were sitting on valuable real estate that other renters would pay more to occupy. Fired by greed and financed by her husband's riches, the Countess first began to clear her Highland estates in 1805. At first, she hoped that building fisheries and manufactories along the coast would tempt her tenants to relocate on their own volition. Unfortunately, that plan didn't work. Those tenants were farmers and herders. They didn't know how to make a living as fishermen or factory employees, and they didn't want to learn. The frustrated Countess launched a second, more aggressive clearance plan in 1807. That year, she evicted tenants whose leases had expired and compelled them to resettle near Loch Naver. After a poor harvest and a brutal winter, many of Loch Naver's tenants chose to emigrate to North America. Their decision scandalized the Countess. Didn't they recognize the generosity of her resettlement program? Why didn't they want to keep working for her? Rather than accept responsibility for her resettlement plan's failure, the Countess blamed the people who had carried out her orders. In 1809, she fired her estate managers and replaced them with two Scottish businessmen who'd studied Adam Smith's ideas at universities. William Young and Patrick Seller promised the Countess that they'd find a way to quadruple rent prices, build vast towns along the Scottish coast, and place evicted tenants in new, modern industries like textile manufacturing and coal mining. The managers vowed that the Countess's estate would never lose another head to emigration. To the contrary, it would grow more populous than it had ever been. Young and Seller got to work on the northwest bounds of the estate in 1812. Tenants wept as they were turned out from the homes they'd occupied for generations. They pleaded with the managers while they packed up their goods and were resettled on a wetter, rockier part of the estate. As word of Young and Seller's actions spread, tenants began to organize resistance efforts. They'd noticed that many of the sheep farmers inheriting the leases on their homes were outsiders who hailed from distant parts of Scotland, or, worse yet, from England. Local leaders protested against what they called foreign devils. Sheep farming, they warned, would dramatically increase the price of food. Surveyors, they claimed, were plotting to burn people's houses. Soon, more than 1,000 tenants, many of whom were well-trained veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, announced that they were willing to take up arms against the clearances. The Countess and her managers began to panic. Young called the tenants savages and proclaimed that he was eager to wage war against them. He told the Countess that she faced two choices. Either she could renounce all claims to her estate and flee the country, or she could summon the British military to crush all resistance. The Countess didn't hesitate. As the people resist by force, she said, no one can complain if they are brought to reason by the same means. Before long, British troops marched onto her estate and suppressed rioters. To offset the bad optics of this incident, the Countess offered to purchase evicted tenants' cattle at prices far above their market worth. Bribes like this allowed her to buy time, but not heartfelt goodwill. In 1814, the tensions that had built for years erupted in an infamous explosion of violence. That January, the Countess ordered her estate managers to resume the clearances. This time, they targeted the wealthiest, most densely populated part of the estate, which housed about 2,000 people. Most of these people knew that Patrick Seller, one of the Countess's managers, possessed a fanatical zeal for his work and a profound contempt for farmers. He believed that tenants who fought back against eviction were impeding profit, progress, and modernity. During the first 2 months of 1814, Seller went from home to home, alerting tenants that their leases wouldn't be renewed in March. Sometimes, he granted families with old women or young children a short, temporary grace period. He believed his actions were exceptionally kind and generous. So, when March came, he was absolutely furious to learn that many tenants had ignored eviction orders altogether. Enraged by this betrayal, as he perceived it, Seller pressed ahead with clearances regardless of whether the tenants were ready and regardless of what he'd promised them earlier. He complained that tenants were too stupid to know what was good for them. He then announced his intention to hunt down all vagabonds and give them a thorough knowledge of right and wrong. What happened next is subject to debate. Many of the allegations that arose against Seller took months or even years to surface. Nonetheless, the story as it's usually told goes as follows. Seller organized a removal party of about 12 men. This party delivered eviction notices from house to house. Whenever tenants offered any display of resistance, the party dragged them from their home, then leveled the entire building using axes, hammers, and fire. By law, Seller was allowed to do this. He was, however, required to let tenants remove their belongings first. In the ensuing court case, Seller's prosecutors alleged that he'd repeatedly ignored this requirement. Far more seriously, they alleged that his pitiless eviction methods had endangered human life. The case against him named 5 victims. 1. Donald Mackay, aged 80, was forced to sleep unsheltered in the woods for several nights after Seller's men destroyed his home. 2. Barbara Mackay, a pregnant woman, was told by Seller to vacate her house before he pulled the roof down on her head. His men then hauled her outside against her will. 3. Donald Munro, a sick child, was dragged out of bed and left outdoors. 4. Donald Macbeth, a bedridden man, watched helplessly as Sellers' men pulled down his entire house except for a few timbers right above his head. He died of exposure soon afterward. 5. Margaret Mackay, aged 90, was too sick to leave her house. Sellers' men set fire to it anyway. Mackay's blankets caught fire, and the men dragged her to a dirty outhouse, where she died. Seller watched while this happened, voiced his approval, and then left the scene. When Seller came to trial in 1816, he denied all the charges against him. More than that, he proclaimed that tenants were unjustly slandering his reputation and that he was the real victim of their crimes. Admittedly, some of the tenants' evidence was dubious. To cite just one example, the daughter of Margaret Mackay, the 90-year-old woman who Sellers' men had allegedly burned alive, testified that her mother hadn't even been at home when Sellers' men set fire to her house. Multiple eyewitnesses contradicted this testimony, and there was no denying that Mackay had died somehow, but the he-said, she-said atmosphere inside the courtroom confused everyone. For their part, Sellers' lawyers tried to keep things simple by arguing that their client was only following the orders of the Countess. Was it really fair to blame a man for following orders? The Inverness court didn't think so. It acquitted Seller of all charges. There was never any realistic chance that it would challenge the legality of clearances per se. The only question was whether it would condemn this one particular case of managerial overreach. By refusing to do even that, the court gave a green light to any and all actions taken by eviction parties in the future. From this moment forward, the Countess of Sutherland, not to mention all of Scotland's other landlords, knew that they could drag tenants from their homes, burn their property, and leave them to die outdoors. The law had unequivocally placed itself on the side of the rich and powerful. In the long term, this was good news for the Countess. In the short term, she now had to cope with tenants who were furious with Sellers' acquittal. By this point, her agents had displaced thousands of people from land they'd occupied for generations. Many of them had to seek new work in industries they didn't understand. Many others made the difficult decision to leave Scotland. Meanwhile, sheep farmers were reporting that gangs of evicted tenants were killing or stealing their animals. The Countess didn't want to hear these stories. After years of clearances, she knew very well that she had every reason to expect a violent uprising against her authority. To make matters worse, the money she'd invested into her estate had failed to pay returns. Poor accounting and a culture of corruption allowed massive sums of cash to disappear without a trace. The new cottages that she'd erected on the coast were dangerous, ramshackle huts. The fisheries and manufactories were failing. And, slowly but surely, the Countess's vast fortune was dwindling. Demonstrating once again that she took no responsibility for her actions, the Countess fired William Young and forced Patrick Seller into an unwilling retirement. She replaced them with a new estate manager, James Locke, who promised to accelerate the clearances without attracting the kind of legal controversy that had plagued his predecessors. Locke proved as good as his word. During the so-called Great Clearance, which began in 1818, he forcibly evicted more than 20% of the estate's population, then burned their homes for good measure. The Highland Glens, Locke said approvingly, were getting so much greener, perfect for sheep farming. In 50 years, he guessed, the Gaelic tongue will be a rarity in Scotland. Locke was right. Human devastation was the Highland Clearance's main consequence. In 1825, one eyewitness described a newly cleared village in stark language.
All was silence and desolation. Blackened and roofless huts, still enveloped in smoke, articles of furniture cast as of no value to the houseless, and a few domestic fowls, scraping for food amid hills of ashes, were the only objects that told us of man. A few days had sufficed to change a countryside, teeming with the cheeriest sounds of rural life, into a desert.
The economic consequences of the clearances were not much better. The new Highland economy, which centered on sheep farming, rarely produced enough income to offset the loss of cattle farms and crop fields. Furthermore, most of the tenants uprooted by sheep farmers barely eked out a living in their new homes on the rocky seaside. They kept a cow or two, tended small garden plots, and accepted temporary, low-wage jobs in tanning or fishing. The Scottish coast, however, never became a hub for industry or trade. England siphoned off whatever new jobs might have been created in the north. The Sutherland family never suffered any serious fallout from its actions. In 1833, the Countess's husband was promoted to a duke, which made her a duchess. Even after she had squandered huge sums on estate improvements, even after she had produced trauma on a generational scale, she remained one of the wealthiest and best-connected women in the country. Her daughter-in-law became one of Queen Victoria's closest friends. The Highland clearances, of which the events in Sutherland were only one small part, systematically destroyed established ways of life. They systematically displaced thousands of people from the homes they'd occupied for generations. They systematically replaced those people with newcomers from abroad. In all of these respects, they strongly resemble the phenomenon that we today define as ethnic cleansing. Without downplaying this resemblance, we need to bear two crucial caveats in mind. First, tenants displaced by the Highland clearances were never subject to a justice system that denied them fundamental rights on the basis of their ethnic heritage. Unlike, say, black South Africans under apartheid, Scottish tenants were unfairly treated on account of being poor, not being racialized. To that end, it's also important to remember that the perpetrators and the victims of the Highland clearances belonged to the same ethno-national group. Patrick Seller was a Scottish businessman who adhered to the ideology of the Scottish economist Adam Smith, whose work he studied at a Scottish university. Likewise, the Countess of Sutherland was born and raised in Edinburgh. In this context, I still think it's reasonable to identify the clearances as ethnic cleansing, but I think it's much more reasonable to interpret them as class warfare. They were always, first and foremost, a conflict between Scottish landlords and Scottish tenants, Scottish owners and Scottish renters, Scottish rich and Scottish poor. In his economic treatise Capital, Karl Marx situates the Highland clearances within the broader history of imperialism and capitalist development.
The robbery of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of reckless terrorism were methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made the soil part and parcel of capital, and created, for the town industries, the necessary supply of a free and outlawed proletariat.
Marx identifies the Highland clearances and English Enclosure as textbook examples of primitive accumulation. In both cases, powerful landowners amassed vast wealth by systematically expropriating other people's property. Their actions destroyed traditional economies and ways of life. They abolished customary rights and privileges, and they made profit into the end goal of human existence. In pursuit of this goal, people with surplus wealth sought out investment opportunities wherever they could find them. They nestled everywhere, settled everywhere, established connections everywhere, even on the rockiest, most barren shores of Scotland. All the while, the British state supported their mad dash for markets using the coercive force of legislatures, courts, and armies. The result was capitalism by means of imperialism. Or, rather, the result was capitalism and imperialism developing simultaneously, by means of one another, until the terms became almost synonymous. They are always processes of blood and fire. They are always acts of land grabbing on a great scale. Chapter 3. The Origins of Industrialization. Why did the Industrial Revolution start in England? This seemingly harmless question has the power to provoke intense, embarrassing public arguments among people usually renowned for their mild manners. For example, the esteemed British broadcaster Melvyn Bragg spent decades hosting the educational BBC radio series In Our Time. Usually, his tone was inquisitive, warm, and avuncular. In one episode, however, things went very wrong. Clearly exasperated by what he perceived as abstract academic navel-gazing, Bragg asked his guest, Professor Emerita Pat Hudson, to explicitly identify the Industrial Revolution's three main causes. Here's what happened next.
Actually, people invented stuff, they made things, those things made other things happen, and you keep denying it. Oh, it's all to do with the broad sweep of history. People invented things that had not been there before, which enabled things to happen which had not happened before. We're going to come to that. What about your causes?
If we're going to come to that, fair enough, but can I say that really does characterise nationalistic accounts of the period.
Well, I would defend it rather more than nationalistic accounts.
With a peculiar sort of emphasis on British genius or...
I didn't say that.
The superiority of the British as a race. This characterised some really almost racist accounts of the Industrial Revolution, which thankfully have now disappeared.
Yeah,
can I say...
By saying what I said is not racist.
Please allow me to say this. I think that if we look...
The broadcast only gets more awkward after that. With the benefit of hindsight, Bragg and Hudson clearly misinterpreted each other's viewpoints. On the one hand, Hudson was right to acknowledge that some accounts of the Industrial Revolution's origins invoke racist arguments about the primacy of British genius. On the other hand, Bragg was right to emphasize that he wasn't making those arguments. All of this makes perfect sense 16 years after the episode first aired. But in the moment, live on the radio, the controversy of the subject matter clouded everybody's judgment. So why exactly should this subject be so controversial in the first place? Just beneath the surface of an abstract conversation about economic history, Bragg and Hudson were debating whether Britain has the right to take pride in its past. To that end, interpretations of the Industrial Revolution often gauge the temperature of Britain's political climate at any given time in history. Between the two world wars, when economic growth was sluggish, British scholars argued that industrialization was a gradual process that occurred over decades and centuries. After the Marshall Plan poured money into Britain to revitalize its national economy, historians began to claim that an explosive economic takeoff sparked a rapid process of industrialization in the 18th century. As the British middle class grew ever larger and more comfortable during the 1960s, scholars like Eric Hobsbawm optimistically asserted that the Industrial Revolution was the most fundamental transformation of human life in the history of the world. Then, following a rapid economic downturn in 1973, historians began to argue that industrialization's impact had initially been very modest and unevenly distributed. The rise and fall of scholarly opinions testifies to new discoveries and bold ideas. In academia, consensus is the sign of a dead field. Nonetheless, I hear Melvyn Bragg clucking his tongue in the background.
Science or
Why?
scientists
Mum,
or
we're going to talk about that later. You're not giving this let's say due in my view, but never mind. We'll get to that in a minute.
He still wants to know how the Industrial Revolution really started. In short, it evolved from earlier varieties of capitalism. During the mercantilist era, or the Age of Sail, transoceanic trade networks fostered the global circulation of consumer goods like tea and coffee. In Britain, meanwhile, Enclosure bolstered food production, which increased the country's population. Many rural people migrated to towns and cities to find work. An ambiguous blend of all these factors helped prepare the formula for industrialization. Then, around 1750, some mysterious catalyst ignited the reaction. What exactly was that catalyst? If you ask 10 scholars, you'll receive 11 different answers. Certain historians believe that British profits from the Atlantic slave trade directly financed the Industrial Revolution. Others propose that slavery indirectly caused what they call an industrious revolution. These historians maintain that British people voluntarily began to work much longer hours so that they could buy addictive, slave-grown goods like sugar and tobacco. A different group of scholars insists that technological development was crucial to industrialization. Machines, such as the spinning jenny or the steam engine, allowed capitalists to manufacture more commodities at a faster pace than ever before. Because Britain was the first country in the world to industrialize, even amateur inventors could develop influential new technologies by solving relatively simple engineering problems in small private workshops. Later inventors in other countries would face far more formidable barriers to entry. Finally, scholars like Bragg's guest, Pat Hudson, have identified geographical and political factors as plausible alternatives to the great man theory of industrialization. 18th century Britain was more centralized than many other European states. It had well-developed highways and canals, but no internal tariffs or trade barriers. These advantages gave rise to a robust domestic market. England and Wales were also blessed with long coastlines and abundant deposits of coal. Merchants here could move goods quickly, and they could use steam power to bypass the limits of wind, water, and muscle. Whatever the cause of Britain's industrialization, its effects were undeniable by the beginning of the 19th century. Although some regions of the countryside remained pristine, coal mining, deforestation, and factory runoff had left others poisonous and polluted. Investors dreamed of infinite growth. Meanwhile, the planet's finite resources deteriorated. Shocked by the horrifying transformations taking place in smoky, squalid cities like Manchester, Wordsworth published one of his most famous sonnets in 1807. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God! I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Despite this poem's power, we should be careful not to talk about industrialization mythologically. For instance, it's a myth that the Industrial Revolution began because of Britain's unique racial genius. Likewise, however, it's a myth that Britain's story isn't special. Because Britain industrialized first, it will always be the only country in world history that faced industrialization's challenges without existing models of success or failure. It's a myth that industrialization was entirely harmful. In the long run, it dramatically increased human lifespans and material comfort. Of course, it's also a myth that industrialization was entirely benign. Since the 18th century, it has created unconscionable levels of wealth inequality and contributed to environmental devastation on a planetary scale. Given the incomprehensible scope of industrialization, and the enormous variety of ways that people have experienced it across space and time, I always find it trite when someone tries to summarize their feelings on it in a phrase or two. To say approvingly that industrialization's long-term benefits outweigh its costs reflects an element of truth, but it also comes across as coldly utilitarian, materially self-interested, and somewhat intellectually uncurious. At the same time, to complain that industrialization has produced enormous quantities of human suffering may be both academically and morally correct, but it seems stubbornly unconcerned with the bigger picture, and it fails to present any viable solution to the problems that it recognizes and decries. Ultimately, I think that any attempt to measure the net total of human suffering against the net total of human happiness will necessarily be crude and stupid. To quantify industrialization's consequences, and to pretend that numbers alone tell the whole story, is to forget what it means to be human. In the rest of this episode, we'll explore Victorian Britain's cotton mills, coal mines, railways, and steamships from the standpoint of the lives they revolutionized. Up next, we're heading back to Mary Burns's hometown, Manchester, whose filthy smokestacks symbolized a new and terrifying mode of mass production. Chapter 4. Manchester, the Cottonopolis. Victoria was the queen of 19th century Britain, but cotton was the king. Until the 18th century, British people usually wore wool to guard themselves against their country's cool, damp climate. The mighty woolen textile industry's never-ending need for sheep farms motivated both Enclosure and the Highland clearances. Consumer trends began to change after the East India Company introduced the British world to South Asian fabrics like muslin and calico. From then on, cotton textiles became highly coveted commodities. For one thing, they were softer on the skin than wool. For another, they were cheaper to produce and purchase. Because growing plants takes fewer resources than raising animals, Britain's cotton textile merchants could afford to undercut their rivals in the woolen industry. Prices dropped even lower after 1793, when the Yale alumnus Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. By making it easier for enslaved American plantation workers to separate fibers from seeds, this device caused a gargantuan cotton boom. In 1785, British merchants had imported 11 million pounds of raw cotton to refine in English textile factories. By the mid-19th century, these merchants were importing more than 588 million pounds every year. Manufactured cotton textiles soon comprised approximately half of British exports. Today, much of the world's clothing is produced in China, Bangladesh, or Vietnam. During the Victorian era, it was almost always made in northern England. At the beginning of the 19th century, most British textile magnates produced garments by means of the putting-out system. Under this system, a wealthy magnate purchased raw cotton, then circulated it across a network of outworkers who transformed the raw materials into finished products in batches at home. Each outworker specialized in a particular stage of the production process, including carding, weaving, spinning, stitching, and dyeing. When workers completed a batch of textiles, they sent them back to the magnate, who paid them a fee and then either passed the garments on to the next outworker or sold the finished product on the market for a profit. The putting-out system was a sophisticated way to manufacture huge amounts of clothing. It was, however, also a decentralized system that required multiple expensive rounds of transit and allowed outworkers the freedom to set their own pace. Because textile magnates wanted to decrease production costs, they began to search for faster, cheaper manufacturing techniques. This is where machines entered the story. Beginning in the late 18th century, new inventions like the spinning jenny and the water frame allowed their operators to complete essential stages of the textile manufacturing process with unprecedented speed. Because these machines were too expensive for most outworkers to afford, wealthy magnates bought them and installed them in textile factories called mills. Here, each step of the production process was completed side by side instead of in the homes of many different people. This development was convenient for textile magnates, but it was absolutely catastrophic for outworkers. Because machines did their jobs faster and more cheaply than they ever could, they could either find a new career, or they could uproot their families, move to the nearest city, and accept a job inside a factory. Before the advent of textile mills, work had gone out to the people. Now, in contrast, the people went into work. Although machines spread slowly across England, and although some parts of the textile production process were industrialized a generation before others, outworkers saw the writing on the wall. Some of them, like the Luddites or the swing rioters, destroyed machines in protest. Despite their efforts, there was no stopping the textile magnates, whose mills accrued unprecedented profits. England's nouveau riche erected mansions, libraries, museums, and train stations, many of which they named after themselves. They bribed politicians, and they purchased seats in Parliament. The millocrats, as they came to be known, behaved like feudal lords ruling new industrial cities in the English Midlands, where rivers flowed fast through the hilly countryside, driving water wheels and powering machines. The largest of these new industrial cities, Manchester, had been a marshy backwater before its population increased tenfold in just 60 years. By 1830, it had become the masterpiece of the Industrial Revolution. Its civic symbol was the worker bee. Its skyline was dotted with smokestacks. Friedrich Engels thought it was a terrifying symbol of the planet's future. In Manchester, he wrote, "The division of labor has been pushed to its furthest limits." He prophesied that the effects would ripple outward in the years to come. People could smell the Cottonopolis before they saw it. One of its longtime residents, the Victorian author Elizabeth Gaskell, described some visitors' first impressions of the city in her novel North and South. For several miles before they reached it, they saw a deep, lead-colored cloud hanging over the horizon in the direction in which it lay. Nearer the town, the air had a faint taste and smell of smoke, a loss of the fragrance of grass and herbage. Upon arriving in the city, visitors remarked on its strange layout. Unlike the haphazard alleyways of London, Manchester looked artificial, almost mass-produced. Gaskell's description dwells upon its long, straight, hopeless streets of regularly built houses. Charles Dickens, who caricatured Manchester as Coketown, wrote a more famous description. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound, upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. Manchester was purposely designed to segregate the rich and poor. Its millocrats erected manor homes to hide themselves from ordinary people. They did business in a neoclassical town hall adorned with marble statues, or they congregated in the Manchester Exchange, which had a glass dome and a sprawling library. In their free time, upper-class Mancunians could patronize a list of institutions that reads like a hyperbolic Dickensian joke. The Natural History Society, the Geological Society, the Statistical Society, the Medical Society, the Law Association, the Royal Institution, the School of Design, 3 separate mechanics institutions, the Salford Museum, a concert hall, a botanical garden. You get the point. Much of the city looked like hell on earth. The other parts had been reserved as playgrounds for the rich. No trip to Manchester would be complete without a visit to its factories, which the Romantic poet William Blake described as dark, satanic mills. These mills clotted the city's rivers and canals. They were stark, boxy buildings made of brick, inside which endless rows of machinery spun cotton textiles at a frantic pace. Don't picture conveyor belts. Those came much later in the 19th century. Picture tall spinning wheels drawing long threads of clean white fabric. An army of laborers, about 3/4 of whom were women and children, operated these machines under the watchful eyes of male foremen and shift managers. If the boss worked in the factory, he did so in a quiet office high above the deafening tumult on the floor. Of course, many bosses worked outside the factory. Some, like Engels' father, didn't even live in England. Unlike outworkers, factory employees didn't manufacture textiles by hand. Anti-industrial activists often ridiculed their work as unskilled labor, but this judgment wasn't really fair. Early industrial machines were hard to operate. If you weren't careful, you could ruin the garment you were making. Worse yet, you could lose your life. Women who worked in textile mills cut their hair short to keep it from tangling in the wheels of a machine, which could pull them in and break their necks or crush their skulls before someone had time to stop it. In 1841, the former factory employee William Dodd authored his autobiography using his one remaining arm. Doctors had had to amputate the other after a gruesome accident. Even breathing in a textile factory was dangerous. In Gaskell's novel North and South, a child laborer named Bessie slowly suffocates and dies over a period of several years. Her lungs, she says, are filling up with fluff, little bits as fly off from the cotton when they're carding it, and fill the air till it looks all fine white dust. They say it winds round the lungs and tightens them up. Anyhow, there's many a one as works in a carding room that falls into a waste, coughing and spitting blood, because they're just poisoned by the fluff. The same condition, byssinosis, still kills textile workers today. Many of the people who downplayed the difficulty, danger, or value of factory work did so because it was performed primarily by young, unmarried women. There are several ways to explain why so much of Britain's factory workforce was female. First, many women were intimately familiar with carding, spinning, weaving, and the other stages of the textile manufacturing process. Second, factory owners could pay unmarried women lower rates than men because they didn't have a spouse or children to support. Finally, owners felt that women were comparatively easy to control. They were physically weaker than men, and they seemed less likely to murder you and burn your factory to the ground if they got angry. For similar reasons, children often worked in factories too. Employers valued their small hands, which fit into the nooks and crannies of machines that needed fixing. Child labor was ubiquitous across Victorian Britain. Most families needed all the supplemental income they could get. Only the very privileged could afford to feed an idle mouth. Given these circumstances, almost no social reformers ever called for universal bans on child employment. At best, some reformers proposed banning children from specific kinds of work alleged to be uniquely dangerous and degrading. Factory work was at the top of many reformers' agendas. During the early 1830s, a parliamentary investigation of the nation's textile mills uncovered hideous abuses of an underage labor force, documented them at length, and published them in a report packed full of interviews with children and other young people. Here's one excerpt from an interview with Elizabeth Bentley, a 23-year-old woman who developed a permanent hunchback after spending her childhood at work inside a flax factory.
What time did you begin work at the factory?
When I was 6 years old.
What were your hours of labor in that mill?
From 5 in the morning to 9 at night.
You are considerably deformed in person as a consequence of your labor?
Yes, I am.
And what time did it come on?
I was about 13 years old when it began coming, and it has got worse since.
Were you perfectly straight and healthy before you worked at the mill?
Yes, I was as straight a little girl as ever went up and down town.
Did your deformity come upon you with much pain and weariness?
Yes, I cannot express the pain all the time it was coming.
Where are you living now?
In the poorhouse.
Faced with many testimonies like Elizabeth's, Parliament passed the Factory Act of 1833, which regulated the conditions of child labor inside textile mills. The new law banned all children under 9 years old from working inside factories. It banned children aged 9 through 12 from working there for more than 48 hours per week. The Factory Act required employers to provide child workers aged 9 through 13 with a lunch break. It also required them to educate these children for at least 2 hours per day. By law, employers were allowed to subtract the cost of a suitable teacher from the child workers' wages. Like the parliamentary reforms that we discussed in Episode 2, the Factory Act was very obviously an attempt to salvage as much of the unsalvageable economic status quo as possible. Although it carefully ceded just barely enough ground to keep disgruntled workers from setting the country on fire, it wasn't a progressive policy, and it was never intended to be so. Despite its half-hearted proposals, the Whigs who controlled Parliament denounced it as a dangerous piece of extremism. Ultimately, the bill passed into law only thanks to an unlikely coalition of left-wing radicals and right-wing aristocrats. The former group supported the Factory Act out of heartfelt conviction. The latter group supported it out of pure spite. They hated the uppity, new money mill owners, and they were willing to do anything to undermine their profits. Notwithstanding government regulations, the textile industry's profits grew and grew. Thanks to machines, a factory employee might take just 2 hours to produce as many garments as an outworker could manufacture in a day. Unfortunately, her employers didn't compensate her heightened productivity by giving her a raise or an afternoon off. Instead, they kept her at her post until her shift was finished. By lunchtime, the garments she'd produced allowed her bosses to recoup the value of her daily wages 3 times over. Nevertheless, she kept working, and, by sunset, she'd produced a massive quantity of surplus value that her employers pocketed as profit. Utopian dreamers are wrong to claim that technological advancements will decrease the hours that employees need to work each day. Spinning jennies might enable you to manufacture shirts at 5 times the pace of an outworker, but your boss will make you work for the whole day regardless of your hourly productivity. He'll accrue unprecedented profits. You'll get nothing extra in return. In Victorian Manchester, where everything revolved around machines and work shifts, the everyday rhythms of human life became profoundly inorganic. Time was money. Therefore, it was meted out so as to maximize the value of each second. Before industrialization, people woke with the sunrise and slept at sunset. Now, they obeyed the ringing of factory bells, which signaled the beginning and the end of each workday. Before industrialization, outworkers took breaks when it suited them. Now, textile magnates told employees when it was appropriate for them to rest, or eat, or go outside, or even use the bathroom. As efficiency increased, the quality of workers' lives decreased proportionately. 19th century labor records reveal that the first generation of industrial workers often refused to assimilate themselves to the unfamiliar rhythms of so-called factory time. These workers were, in a manner of speaking, new immigrants to the factory floor. As such, they maintained traditional attitudes toward labor that infuriated their employers, who responded with crude appeals to the importance of constant hard work. To quote the historian E.P. Thompson,
"Throughout the 19th century, the propaganda of time thrift continued to be directed at the working people, the rhetoric becoming more debased, the apostrophes to eternity becoming more shop-soiled, the homilies more mean and banal. In early Victorian tracts and reading matter aimed at the masses, one is choked by the quantity of the stuff."
Even as employers accused them of laziness, Manchester's workers desperately fought to survive. Countless writers published ghastly exposés about the working class's health. According to Elizabeth Gaskell's husband, a physician named Peter, malnutrition left most factory employees several inches shorter than the average person. He observed that the workers' complexions were sallow and pallid. They had slender limbs, bowed legs, thin hair, and spiritless attitudes that spoke to something like learned helplessness. Peter Gaskell's findings corresponded to national trends. During the 1830s and 40s, population growth in England's industrial cities outpaced the rate at which they could produce high-protein foods like meat and milk. Because many people literally couldn't find enough to eat, and because they couldn't afford much food anyway, there were years in which the average Manchester laborer died at 17. The Industrial Revolution didn't bring immediate prosperity and comfort. To the contrary, historians have determined that the 1840s were the worst decade for life expectancy in Britain since the time of the Black Death. It's no surprise that workers died so early. Hungry people were susceptible to illness, Manchester's air was smoggy, and its water was polluted by industrial runoff. Engels described the city's main river, the Irk, as a coal-black, foul-smelling stream full of debris and refuse. In dry weather, he said,
A long string of the most disgusting, blackish-green slime pools are left standing on the riverbank, from the depths of which bubbles of miasmatic gas constantly arise and give forth a stench unendurable even on the bridge, 40 or 50 feet above the surface of the stream.
Many of Manchester's workers lived in shoddily built tenements maintained by landlords who refused to make improvements or repairs. One of Elizabeth Gaskell's most harrowing realist novels, Mary Barton, describes them in appalling detail. "It was very dark inside," she writes. "The window panes were broken and stuffed with rags. The smell was so fetid as almost to knock men down." When the novel's protagonists enter an apartment room that looks like a converted cellar, they see 3 or 4 little children rolling on the damp, nay, wet brick floor, through which the stagnant, filthy moisture of the street oozed up. The fireplace was empty and black. The wife sat on her husband's lap and cried in the dank loneliness. Given the appalling state of life at home, many workers drowned their sorrow in cheap pleasures. Men sought out the company of prostitutes, almost all of whom were desperate women who had nowhere left to turn. Workers of both sexes squandered their wages in gin palaces, warm, bright bars that sold huge volumes of intoxicating spirits. Dickens' industrial novel Hard Times paints a haunting picture of working-class alcoholism. Years of drinking have transformed the protagonist's wife into what he calls a disabled creature, barely able to preserve her sitting posture by steadying herself with one begrimed hand on the floor. The protagonist of Hard Times laments that there is no way out of poverty. Like addiction, it always finds a way to suck you back into the dark abyss. Manchester's workers didn't passively accept their fates. Instead, grassroots activists transformed England's industrial cities into laboratories where they tested radical new tactics of resistance. Trade unions were the most effective method of collective action. Therefore, it's no surprise that wealthy lawmakers became extremely hostile to them. Parliament legalized unions in 1825, but it forbade their members from going on strike or bargaining for better working conditions. As we saw in Episode 2, law courts routinely imprisoned or deported union members on extremely flimsy pretexts. Meanwhile, almost every middle-class writer denounced union membership as a dangerous conspiracy against the nation's common interests. Take the work of Harriet Martineau, one of the world's first sociologists. Today, she's best known for publishing a series of economics primers thinly disguised as novels. In didactic paragraphs of tremendous length, Martineau's characters explain the value of good habits, such as discipline and thrift. One installment of her work depicts a factory employee urging his colleagues to go on strike. "It is necessary for laborers to husband their strength if it is ever to be balanced against the influence and wealth of capitalists. A master can do as he pleases with his 100 or 500 workmen unless they are combined." As soon as this pro-union speech is over, another, allegedly more rational member of the working class refutes it. "The first man who deserts the work he has pledged himself to perform puts the weapon of the law into the hands of our opponents. The first who is legally convicted of a breach of contract brands our cause with indelible disgrace. Honor towards our masters is as necessary as fidelity to each other." The author clearly agrees with this character's perspective, and she clearly expects her readers to do the same. At the end of her story, the most industrious laborers go back to work. Only the troublemakers continue to parade through the streets. Martineau, who was barely 30 years old at the time when she published this treatise, wasn't deliberately writing propaganda for the status quo. Nonetheless, the state strongly approved of her message. In 1838, the British royal family even invited her to be a special guest at Queen Victoria's coronation ceremony. During the early Victorian era, Manchester was both a place of unique terrors and a place that represented broader socioeconomic changes across England. We might imagine the city like a smallpox pustule, foul, putrescent, and unsightly, but ultimately only symptomatic of a deeper, underlying illness that threatens the body's survival. People in the 19th century were used to poverty, but what they saw in Manchester looked unfamiliar. Here, a new way of existence sprang up in a single generation. Sprawling pleasure palaces arose alongside labyrinthine slums. The staggeringly rich deliberately segregated themselves from the working poor. Millocrats and textile magnates didn't even feign to care about the workers who outnumbered them by a factor of hundreds to one. All pretense of a social contract had been jettisoned. Life in the city was nasty, cruel, brutish, and most of all, short. Chapter 5. Coal Mining. Listeners should be advised that this chapter includes references to child abuse and animal cruelty. If you're sensitive to these subjects, then I recommend skipping ahead to Chapter 6. At the top of the mine shaft, the temperature reached 35 degrees Celsius, and there was no air, so in time, you could die of suffocation. In order to see what he was doing, a miner had to fix a lamp on a nail over his head, which made his blood run hot. The rock above him was only a few centimeters away from his face, and large drops of water streamed from it rapidly and relentlessly, falling with an apparently obstinate rhythm, always hitting the same spot. However much he twisted and turned his neck backwards and sideways, the drops kept splashing his face, spattering and slapping him remorselessly. After a quarter of an hour, he was soaked, covered in his own sweat as well, giving off a stream of dirty, warm vapor. He hacked away so furiously at the earth that he shook with the vibrations, wedged between his two levels of rock, like a green fly caught between the pages of a book which threatened to slam suddenly shut. This passage comes from the French writer Émile Zola's great novel of the coal mines, Germinal. Originally published in 1885, it became one of the most influential and enduring 19th century narratives, not least because Zola had researched his subject so thoroughly. Although he was a middle-class Parisian, he had visited French mining towns to interview striking workers and descend into the depths of coal pits. Thanks to Zola's research, Germinal is relevant to our podcast even though it's not an English-language novel. Few other sources study the 19th century coal mine in such fastidious detail, and no other source explores its brutalizing impact on the human psyche with such insight. Machinery and fossil fuels sustained each other in a feedback loop that energized the Industrial Revolution. Coal-powered steam engines allowed workers to pump water from mine shafts more effectively. This made it possible for them to extract more coal, to power more engines, to pump more mine shafts, to extract more coal, to power more engines, to pump more mine shafts, and so forth indefinitely at rapidly accelerating rates. In 1750, coal fulfilled about 60% of England's energy needs. A century later, it fulfilled more than 90%. Throughout history, Britain's coal reserves have produced at least as much energy as the cumulative total of oil extracted from Saudi Arabia. Like Saudi Arabia, moreover, 19th century Britain exported fossil fuels for profit. In 1800, it had a near monopoly on global coal production. Coal enabled what initially appeared to be unlimited economic growth. From 1770 to 1815, the British cotton industry relied primarily on water wheels for power. During that time, textile output increased by a spectacular 2,200%. By 1820, however, production rates had hit a natural ceiling. Textile magnates couldn't force the country's rivers to flow faster, and they could only build so many water wheels before they ran out of space on the riverbanks. At this point, transitioning from rivers and water power to coal and steam power allowed magnates to prolong enormous rates of growth year after year. Fossil fuels produce more energy than other sources, and their output is much easier to regulate. As a result, production rates could smash straight through the ceiling. Now, the only thing that held back economic growth was how many machines a magnate could afford to buy. The coal boom's social consequences were as revolutionary as its economic ones. Britain's large and growing population of miners developed a distinctive working-class culture shaped by the ubiquity of mortal peril. According to Friedrich Engels, there is no other occupation in which a man may meet his end in so many diverse ways, including cave-ins, floods, heat stroke, poison gas, asphyxiation, and sheer physical exhaustion. At the beginning of each shift, work crews descended to the bottom of the coal mine in an elevator like an iron cage. Lanterns were their only source of light. The thin air smelled of sweat and saltpeter. In the ventilation tunnels, an icy wind blew with the force of a gale. Deeper down the shaft, the air was hot and still. The mine was deafeningly loud. Metal tools clanged upon rocks, steam pumps shrieked, workers shouted orders, railway carts packed full of coal crashed into one another. The ponies that pulled these carts whinnied. They'd been lowered down into the mines as foals, and they would never see the light of day again. Zola describes one poor pit pony named Bataille. For 10 years he had lived in this hole, staying in the same corner of the stable, doing the same job, trotting up and down the dark haulage roads. He had grown accustomed to the dark, and extremely clever. He must have been able to count, for when he had done the regulation number of trips, he refused to start another, and insisted on being taken back to his manger. Now, with old age, his cat's eyes would sometimes cloud over with melancholy. Perhaps he had a vague vision, in the dim light of his dreams, of the mill where he was born, surrounded by broad meadows and swept by a constant breeze. There was something bright and burning in the air, a sort of huge lamp, but the creature would not recall it exactly. And he lowered his head, trembling on his aged legs in his futile attempts to remember what the sun was like. Pit ponies like Bataille were buried in the mines after they died. The miners often mourned them. They recognized these animals as symbols of their own exploited lives. Coal mining was so difficult and dangerous that workers bonded with each other as though they were comrades in arms. It was very clear to most of them that their employers knew little and cared less about what life was really like under the earth. In times of economic hardship, mine owners set unattainable production quotas, ignored safety measures, and cut wages. And so, just as angry soldiers sometimes mutiny against their officers, disaffected coal miners laid down their tools and illegally went on strike. The unique conditions of the mining industry made labor activism unusually effective. For example, most mines raised coal to the surface using just one elevator. After the coal had left the mine, it was transported to depots on a single railway track. Miners who took advantage of these choke points' vulnerability to sabotage possessed a disproportionate amount of power to disrupt the national economy, which would collapse without a constant stream of fossil fuels. Throughout the Victorian era, miners occupied the vanguard of the British labor movement. Their activism persisted long into the 20th century, until the far-right Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher systematically destroyed the power of organized labor by dismantling the nation's trade unions. Many Victorian miners were also minors, that is to say, children. Oftentimes, employers hired 10-year-olds to guide pit ponies or carry messages between the other workers. These jobs were heinous, but they weren't the very worst that coal mines had to offer. Perversely, the worst jobs were assigned to the smallest boys and girls. Many tunnels were just 16 inches high, which was, of course, too narrow for ponies to enter. In these tunnels, children called hurriers served as beasts of burden. They were chained to wagons carrying coal, which they were forced to drag toward the surface of the mine. Children known as thrusters did the same work, but they pushed instead of pulling. In any case, the wagons usually weighed at least 200 pounds. The heaviest of them could weigh a quarter ton. For what little it's worth, hurriers and thrusters had the opportunity to work together as a team. In contrast, the very youngest children in the coal mine, some of whom were barely 5 years old, were forced to work as trappers. They sat utterly alone in total darkness, opening and closing flaps on ventilation shafts. In Germinal, Zola describes exploited child workers growing almost feral in the mines. As one teenage girl drags a minecart, she seems to be trotting on all fours, like some small circus animal. By the end of the novel, an 11-year-old boy has degenerated into what the narrator describes as a little toad, a monkey, and a wildcat. He steals, he snarls, he kills. He shows no loyalty to humankind. Instead, like J.R.R. Tolkien's character Gollum, he prefers to live in darkness underground. If Zola's account of child labor strikes you as sensational, it's worth considering official evidence presented to the British government. In 1838, a thunderstorm flooded the Husker Pit in South Yorkshire, drowning 26 children in a span of minutes. Public outrage over this accident, not to mention many others like it, pressured British lawmakers to convene a Royal Commission of Inquiry into children's employment. The report that it delivered before Parliament from 1842 to 1843 was absolutely scathing. The commissioners described the hideous working conditions of child laborers in Britain's coal mines. Many of them quoted children's first-hand testimonies. Here's an excerpt from an interview with Margaret Peggy Gomley, aged 9.
I worked in the pit last winter. I don't know at what hour I went down, as we have no clock, but it was daylight. It was 6 o'clock when we came up, but not always. They flog us down in the pit, sometimes with their hand upon my bottom, which hurts me very much. Thomas Copeland flogs me more than once in a day, which makes me cry. There are 2 other girls working with me, and there was 4, but one left because she had a bellyache. I am poorly myself sometimes with bellyache, and sometimes headache. The men often swear at me.
Accounts like Peggy's horrified the British public, but not primarily because of violence in the workplace. Unfortunately, it was very common for 19th century parents, teachers, and employers to hit children. The deeper scandal of testimonies like Peggy's centered on decency. Notice that her adult male supervisors hit her not on her ear or the back of her head, which would be typical, but, as she says, upon her bottom. Coal mining was scandalous because it left children, especially girls, vulnerable to sexual abuse by strangers in the dark. One of the royal commissioners describes what he saw in the mine where Peggy worked.
3 girls arrived before me, with as many boys. It was impossible in the dark to distinguish the sexes. They were all naked, excepting their shifts or shirts.
Zola's novel Germinal likewise describes adults and children stripping almost naked to avoid dying of heatstroke in the coal mines. The atmosphere that reigned in the pit, writes Zola, was bestial, with sudden violent outbursts of animal desire when a miner came across one of the girls bending over with her bottom up in the air. No matter whether coal mines were in England or in France, they became appalling symbols of a country that was actively endangering its smallest and most vulnerable citizens. The Royal Commission's report inspired one especially poignant response from a wealthy young Englishwoman named Elizabeth Barrett. Today, people usually refer to her by her married name, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, or EBB for short. For clarity's sake, I'll use that name even though she wasn't married yet in 1843, when she published her poem The Cry of the Children. EBB is best known for her love sonnets, especially How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. In my view, The Cry of the Children is a less experienced piece of writing than her later work. Nonetheless, the poem appeared in the hugely influential Blackwoods magazine, and it perfectly expressed the outraged mood of the moment. Here's a short excerpt to give you a feel for the piece as a whole. Do ye hear the children weeping, O my brothers, ere the sorrow comes with years? They are leaning their young heads against their mothers, and that cannot stop their tears. The young lambs are bleating in the meadows. The young birds are chirping in the nest. The young fawns are playing with the shadows. The young flowers are blowing toward the west. But the young children, O my brothers, they are weeping bitterly. They are weeping in the playtime of the others, in the country of the free. Throughout this poem, EBB invokes the symbol of the lamb. In doing so, she associates child workers with the infant Christ, and implicitly asks readers to imagine how they'd feel if the savior of humankind had been consigned to work in coal mines in his boyhood. At the end of the poem, child workers cry out in agony like Christ upon the cross. Who is God that he should hear us? They demand. We look up to God, but tears have made us blind. These lines identify the literal darkness of the mines with the spiritual darkness into which those mines have plunged the nation. EBB knew very well who had the power to write laws in Britain. The Cry of the Children was addressed to privileged readers, and it was designed to be a talking piece at dinner parties where lawmakers socialized. By the time it actually appeared in print, however, Parliament had already enacted new reforms to regulate the country's mining industry. The Mines Act of 1842 banned all girls and women from working underground. Boys under 10 years old were banned as well. This was certainly a triumph, but, as with all of the reforms that we've encountered in this series, it was incomplete. Pressure from industrialists in Parliament had gradually rewritten the bill's language, stripped away key provisions, and made it far less radical. Many lawmakers refused to tolerate even this neutered version. It would probably never have passed into law were it not for some conservative aristocrats' desire to rub dirt in the eyes of new money mine owners. Ultimately, the Mines Act was a referendum on industrialization, not the ethics of employing children. The coal industry had changed the face of child labor. It was the change, and not the labor, that offended Tory lawmakers. While they reveled in their legislative victory against the Whigs, few people on either side of the aisle stopped to wonder how the nation would atone for all those children who had spent their first years underground. How could anybody speak of what those children felt? How could anybody live with it? And how could anything else matter other than the knowledge that they'd suffered? I'll conclude this chapter with the words of Sarah Gooder.
I'm a trapper in the Gobber pit. It does not tire me, but I have to trap without a light, and I'm scared. Sometimes I sing when I've light, but not in the dark. I dare not sing then. I don't like being in the pit. I have heard tell of Jesus many times. I don't know why he came on earth.
Sarah was 8 years old. Chapter 6. Railway Mania. Railways predate the use of steam engines by several hundred years. From at least as early as the 1550s, Europeans were building short wooden tracks to help cart horses pull wagons on wheels. Many such railways were still in use during the 19th century. As we saw in the previous chapter, they were a common feature of Victorian coal mines. Steam power fundamentally transformed the scope of railways. After a British engineer patented the first steam engine in 1698, 18th century inventors like James Watt gradually developed safer, more powerful variants of the original design. From 1825 onward, railway networks carrying steam-powered locomotives crisscrossed England with astonishing speed. the absence of tall mountains made it easy to lay new tracks, and the ubiquitous proximity of the sea allowed even short lines to connect to major shipping ports. Originally, England's railways were designed to haul commodities like coal and cotton. By the 1840s, though, more than 40 million passengers were riding trains each year. Railway companies accommodated British culture's deeply rooted classism by segregating these passengers into different carriages based on how much money they could pay. Passengers in first-class carriages enjoyed padded seats and ceilings built of stable wooden beams. In contrast, third-class passengers were lucky if their carriage had seats or a ceiling at all. Discomfort didn't stop poor people from riding trains, however. The reactionary Duke of Wellington complained that railways overturned traditional society by encouraging the lower classes to travel wherever they wanted. He was right. Railways not only symbolized revolutionary industrialization, but also accelerated it by creating huge new markets for iron and coal, facilitating the long-distance transport of commercial goods, and allowing job seekers to navigate between big cities. Investors smelled an opportunity for profit. From 1835 to 1837, and then again from 1844 to 1847, so-called railway mania gripped the British nation as people poured their money into trains. The Industrial Revolution had allowed textile magnates, mine owners, and shipping executives to accumulate so much wealth so quickly that they literally didn't know what to do with it. At the same time, an emerging demographic of middle-class families had finally saved enough money that they could afford to invest in long-term growth. National and international railway building soon absorbed fully 1/2 of private investment in Britain. In 1830, there were a few dozen miles of railway on Earth. By 1850, that number had increased more than 500-fold. Like today's cryptocurrencies, the vast majority of railway companies were terrible investments. Yes, it was theoretically possible to reap spectacular returns. No, this didn't happen to anyone who even remotely resembled the average person. The typical annual return on a railway investment was approximately 3%. Many people made much less than that, and many people lost their money altogether. Because Parliament proved slow to regulate the railway industry, companies often bragged of profits that existed only on paper. As investors purchased shares, sold them off, and realized that the companies had no assets to repay them, the railway bubble often burst, only to reinflate a few years later. As you can probably guess, Britain's railway boom was never centrally planned. Instead, private companies acted on their own initiative based on what they speculated might be profitable. This practice made coordination between different railway lines almost impossible. Companies built tracks using incompatible gauges, lines that were supposed to meet up in the middle accidentally bypassed each other, and communication between trains was unreliable. In the early days of railway mania, most lines passed messages using semaphore flags. The problem, of course, is that you can't see flags after sunset. It's also hard to see them in the rain or fog, which, in Britain's case, means that it's almost always hard to see them. Thankfully, the telegraph, which the American inventor Samuel Morse patented in 1837, soon made it much easier for trains to notify each other of breakdowns or delays. Together, railways and telegraphs became twin symbols of modernity. In the United States, they carried the so-called manifest destiny of civilization far past the horizon. In continental Europe, they struck fear into the hearts of conservative monarchs. France and Prussia banned private citizens from using telegraphs, and they required every sender to submit all messages for government inspection. Extreme measures like these reveal technology's power to upend established norms. A new railway line's arrival in a sleepy town was a bit like the arrival of a Walmart. It brought coveted commodities to customers, but it also threatened to put small shops out of business. Charles Dickens' novel Dombey and Son dramatizes the transformation of a village called Stagg's Gardens. Following a railway line's arrival, there was no such place as Stagg's Gardens. It had vanished from the earth. Now there were only railway hotels, office houses, lodging houses, boarding houses, railway plans, maps, views, wrappers, bottles, sandwich boxes, and timetables, railway hackney coach and stands, railway omnibuses, railway streets and buildings, railway hangers-on and parasites, and flatterers out of all calculation. There was even railway time observed in clocks, as if the sun itself had given in. Dickens felt that trains produced conveniences and carcasses in roughly equal measure. Thomas Carlyle, the grumpy social critic whom we met in episode 1, was less circumspect. He compared riding a train to taking a Faust's flight on the devil's mantle. It was unnatural and even demonic. For all its over-the-top drama, this comment registers wider societal unease about the rapid pace of modern life. By the 1840s, passengers could travel from London to Manchester in just 8 hours. People had never experienced this kind of speed before. One astonished writer remarked that the view from his train window looked like a kaleidoscope. At the end of the 19th century, British doctors warned the public of a neurological disorder known as railway spine. The routine bumps and jostles of a train ride, they alleged, could overstimulate the spinal nerves and traumatize the brain, producing symptoms such as fainting, hypersensitivity, insanity, and even death. In fact, there was no such disorder as railway spine. It was a psychosomatic condition brought about by mass hysteria. This doesn't mean that trains weren't dangerous, however. Locomotives were a new kind of machine, and engineers weren't always sure how to maintain them. Brakes failed, and engines exploded with alarming frequency. Although railway spine from routine travel was a myth, gruesome head-on collisions between trains left many passengers with broken spines, or worse. The best-known account of a 19th century train crash comes from the French novel La Bête Humaine, or The Human Beast, which Émile Zola published in 1890. The train reared up in the air, 7 carriages climbing one on top of the other, and then everything fell back down with the most dreadful splintering sound into a jumbled mass of wreckage. Upside down, her belly gaping, the train was losing steam through burst tubes and wrenched-off taps, her thunderous puffing like the desperate dying gasps of some female giant. A white breath was coming out of her, inexhaustibly, thick swirls of it rolling across the ground, while the burning coals that had fallen from the firebox, as red as though they were the very blood from her entrails, added their plumes of black smoke. Like French writers, British ones used train crashes to symbolize modern life's dehumanizing bureaucracy or unmanageable speed. In a ghost story titled Number 1 Branch Line, The Signal Man, Dickens reflected that there was no official channel through which railway employees could report a supernatural premonition of disaster. In Cranford, a satirical novel of small-town life, Elizabeth Gaskell depicted a train striking and killing a man who didn't hear it coming because he was too distracted by the latest serial installment of the Pickwick Papers. This scene alluded to William Huskisson, a prominent member of Parliament, who suffered a grisly, preventable, and ultimately very stupid death in 1830, when he froze like a deer in the headlights before an oncoming locomotive. Huskisson's death reminds us that even wealthy, privileged people struggled to adjust to the new rhythms of industrial society. Moved by tragic accidents and bad investments, Parliament at last began to regulate the railway industry. Between 1845 and 1847, it passed no fewer than 442 separate railway acts. Among many other things, these acts decreed that entrepreneurs had to receive official parliamentary approval before founding a new railway company, that existing railway companies were subject to financial audits by the Board of Trade, and that third-class carriages had to install roofs for passengers' safety. These measures reflected lawmakers' growing consciousness that railways were here to stay. As trains became a fact of life, they gradually became the pride of Britain. No person benefited from this process more than the titanic British engineer named Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Like Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby School, Brunel's contemporaries recognized him as a hero of their age. Unlike Thomas Arnold, Brunel remains beloved even today. In a BBC poll of the 100 greatest Britons of all time, he placed second, behind only Winston Churchill. In 2006, his face was stamped upon the £2 coin. In 2012, Kenneth Branagh portrayed him during the London Olympics opening ceremonies. Brunel was born in Portsmouth in 1806 to an English mother and a French father. As a boy, he showed a special aptitude for geometry, mechanics, and engineering. Because his father wanted him to have a useful education, not an English one, he sent young Isambard abroad to learn in France. Ironically, this means the greatest engineering mind in British history wasn't the product of the British school system. When the 17-year-old Brunel returned to England, he took a job with his father, a civil engineer who'd been commissioned to construct a railway tunnel underneath the River Thames. Cave-ins and floods plagued the project. Brunel's courage in the face of these repeated accidents made him a celebrated name across the country. On one occasion, he plunged into a flooded shaft and rescued a workman from drowning. On another occasion, he labored for 96 straight hours without ever pausing to sleep. The Thames Tunnel, complete with an underground shopping mall, opened to spectacular fanfare in 1843. It remains in use today. 10 years before the tunnel project ended, Brunel left it to become chief engineer for the Great Western Railway. Now commanding his own team of workers, he designed a railway line that ran from London to Bristol. This project revealed both his Promethean ambitions and his flabbergasting disconnection from reality. For example, he refused to use Britain's most common railway gauge because he felt that it was something fit for donkey carts, not locomotives. A broader gauge, he argued, would give passengers a smoother ride, and it would allow trains to transport heavier loads. Although he was correct on both counts, his insistence on using a broad gauge meant that the Great Western Railway couldn't link itself to other lines. Like its chief engineer, it had to stand alone. Brunel's other fantasies about the railway were still more impractical. He dreamed that passengers might travel from London to New York City on a single ticket. When their train reached the shores of the Atlantic, they would transfer to a steamship that would carry them to North America. He also envisioned a so-called atmospheric railway that would propel trains via a system of pressurized air powered by vacuum pumps. If it had worked, the atmospheric railway would have made steam power obsolete. Unfortunately for Brunel, it didn't work. The system was outrageously expensive to construct, and it was far too fragile to be practical in any uncontrolled environment. Luckily, Brunel's failures, most of which were as compelling as his triumphs, added to the fame of the Great Western Railway. When the line opened for business in 1841, it became a national sensation, not least because its broad gauge allowed trains to travel at 60 miles per hour, which was nearly twice the speed that passengers were used to. In essence, Brunel had designed the 19th century equivalent to a bullet train. It still numbers among his greatest achievements. Brunel's work on the Great Western Railway made him a global celebrity. Over the decades that followed, he served as a consultant on engineering projects in Italy, Ireland, Australia, and India. At home in England, he repeatedly testified before Parliament as an engineering expert. He designed London's Paddington Station, and he became renowned for his suspension bridges and his viaducts. As an architect, Brunel wedded material efficiency to artistic taste. He believed the British public would find beauty in a railway only if its engineering were invisible. To that end, he designed bridges that blended into nature by flowing like water or towering like pillars of rock. When Brunel passed away in 1859, thousands of railway workers attended his funeral. An epitaph in the Morning Chronicle asserted that the history of invention records no instance of grand novelties so boldly imagined and so successfully carried out by the same individual. I think that Brunel's almost universal popularity in Britain stems from the fact that he planted his feet in two eras. In one respect, he was essentially a handyman who promised that all engineering problems could be solved with elbow grease and ingenuity. This version of Brunel is history's last lone genius, tinkering with inventions in a private workshop. Think Leonardo da Vinci. In another respect, Brunel was essentially a charismatic technocrat who commanded a vast team of professionally trained engineers. This version of him is history's first modern project manager, collaborating with a team of experts to solve challenges that none of them could possibly have tackled individually. Think Steve Jobs. Rest assured, we'll meet Brunel again in future episodes of Melting into Air. Actually, we'll meet him again in this episode's very next chapter. Before then, though, I want to conclude this chapter on Railway Mania by reflecting on the most ambiguous image of Britain's Industrial Revolution. The English artist J.M.W. Turner exhibited his famous painting Rain, Steam and Speed in London in 1844. This painting, which you can see in Britain's National Gallery, or on the podcast website at meltingintoair.net, portrays an oncoming train racing across a bridge on Brunel's newly opened Great Western Railway. On the canvas's right side, directly in the train's path, you can barely see a faint brown smudge that represents a darting rabbit. Rain, Steam and Speed's effect derives from the ironic contrast that it draws between the stillness of the image and the speed of the scene it depicts. Trains, especially those on the Great Western Railway, obviously move too fast for Turner to have painted this scene from real life. Even so, some of the image's first viewers speculated that he'd painted extremely quickly in a conscious attempt to embody the pace of his subject. The novelist William Makepeace Thackeray commented on what he called Turner's dabs of dirty putty slapped onto the canvas with a trowel. He disliked Rain, Steam and Speed, but he admitted that the world had never seen anything like it. Images of speeding trains slowly became more familiar. In 1896, the Lumière brothers released one of history's first films, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station. Allegedly, the early showings produced panic in the audience, which thought the large black locomotive approaching the camera might crash through the movie screen and hit them. Thackeray had jokingly expressed the same fear when he saw Rain, Steam and Speed 50 years earlier. Viewers had best make haste to see it, he warned, lest the train should dash out of the picture. Anecdotes like these two evoke industrialization's role as a mass spectacle capable of amusing the public at large. During the 1910s and 20s, however, Turner's emphasis on industrial progress and speed would influence a far more sinister group of artists than the Lumière brothers, namely, the Italian Futurists. The Futurists' leader, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, declared that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A roaring motor car which seems to run on machine gun fire is more beautiful than Greek statues like the Nike of Samothrace. Marinetti was an unapologetic fascist whose love of speed aligned with his desire for destruction on a global scale. As the Futurists imagined it, industrialization ought to crush the masses, kill the decadent, and elevate the strong. Both these visions of industrialization, as amusement on the one hand and as violence on the other, were already implicit at the dawn of the industrial era, in the canvas of Rain, Steam and Speed. I mentioned that a rabbit is running in the path of the oncoming train. What's about to happen in this scene? Is an animal outpacing human engineering? Or, alternatively, is the train about to strike and vaporize an emblem of the natural world? Maybe it's significant that the rabbit is extremely hard to see. The train, in contrast, is impossible to miss. Amid Turner's dazed and dreamy yellows, its chimney is a hard black line that draws the eye. It's dark, assertive, aggressive. There's no doubt that rain, steam, and speed showcases the triumph of the Industrial Revolution. But Turner's attitude toward that triumph seems deliberately ambiguous. To my mind, the painting has always looked haunted. Its fetishism of futurity, technology, and willful forward progress serves as an uncomfortable reminder that only a century separates the locomotive speeding down the Great Western Railway from the cattle cars that carried human beings into Auschwitz. Chapter 7. Steamships. Long before the advent of the steam engine, Britain already possessed by far the largest, most advanced fleet in the world. Its ships existed in huge numbers, its sailors were well trained to use them, and the entire system was so profitable that most innovations looked like risky and superfluous expenses. Academics use the term technological lock-in to describe situations like this one, in which a history of success discourages investment in new ideas. Lock-in meant that Britain's steamship business grew more slowly than its railway industry. When the first steam-powered vessels appeared on the River Thames in 1815, they were only a few tiny tugboats built to serve much larger and more numerous sailing ships. Even at mid-century, the busy port of Liverpool was home to only 93 steamships, as opposed to 1,750 sail-powered ones. In practical terms, this situation meant that steamships proved extremely slow to change the face of British nautical culture. Expertise in traditional crafts like knot-making and astronavigation faded only very gradually, and engineers never fully displaced sailors in Victorian ports. It's only natural that the 19th century's great works of naval fiction almost all take place on sailing ships, not steamships. Isambard Kingdom Brunel never let a pesky thing like tradition interfere with his grand aspirations. During the 1830s, when he was revolutionizing land-based travel, he decided that he might as well conquer the sea while he was at it. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, Brunel fantasized that passengers aboard the Great Western Railway would be able to journey all the way from London to New York City on a single ticket. When their train reached the Atlantic, they would simply transfer to a steamship that would carry them across the ocean. In 1835, Brunel convinced the Great Western Railway to form a subsidiary Great Western Steamship Company. There was just one problem with his proposed business model. The farther a steamship traveled, the more coal it had to carry. The more coal it carried, the less room it had to carry passengers who paid for tickets. Under these circumstances, nobody was really sure whether a transatlantic ferry would be profitable. Brunel refused to take no for an answer. Instead, he promised his employers that he could design a steamship so effective that it guaranteed to cut a profit. He then volunteered to do the necessary engineering work for free. The result was the SS Great Western. She had masts and sails, but also a steam-powered paddle wheel. Her wooden hull was reinforced with iron, and, at 236 feet long, she was the largest passenger ship the 19th century world had ever seen. Brunel had calculated that larger steamships consumed proportionately less fuel than smaller ones. Extrapolating from that calculation, he'd theorized that an extremely large vessel could carry enough coal to complete a transatlantic crossing and enough passengers to make that crossing profitable. The Great Western's maiden voyage put his theory to the test. The ship departed Bristol on April 8, 1838. 15 days later, she arrived in New York City, proving Brunel right. This triumph encouraged the Great Western Steamship Company to invest more resources in Brunel's work. His next project was the SS Great Britain. She was nearly 100 feet longer than her record-setting predecessor. She was also made entirely of metal, powered solely by an engine, and designed with a propeller, not a paddle wheel. By today's standards, these features made her the first modern ship in world history. Following her maiden voyage in 1845, the Great Britain made regular journeys across the Atlantic. Her first-class passengers slept in comfortable cabins and took their meals in a lavish saloon adorned with polished mirrors, arabesques, and paintings of exotic wildlife. By this point in his career, Brunel seemed unstoppable. His acclaim had reached an all-time high, and he'd become obsessed with building ever larger, ever more luxurious steamships. Financially, his vast ambitions sometimes doomed his sponsors. Within a year of the Great Britain's maiden voyage, the cost of building and maintaining the world's largest ship had bankrupted her owners. By that time, however, Brunel had already moved on to his next project. Companies were scrambling to hire him. Sure, he was phenomenally expensive, but how could his work ever be a bad investment? He was the world's best engineer. He was a living legend. And so, he got to work on the SS Great Eastern. At 692 feet long, this steamship was more than twice the length of the Great Britain, which had already been big enough to ruin her owner. The Great Eastern was designed to carry up to 4,000 passengers from England to Australia without ever stopping for fuel. Brunel called her his Great Babe. Journalists compared her to a floating city or a crystal palace. She was packed with lounges and saloons, glass chandeliers, hand-sculpted balustrades, and plush four-poster beds. Her construction exhausted Brunel, who died barely 2 weeks after her maiden voyage in 1859. Some people insisted that this voyage confirmed Brunel's reputation as a genius ahead of his time. Others felt that it cemented his legacy as an unrealistic and uncompromising megalomaniac. British newspapers informed the public that a steam explosion on the ship had killed 5 crewmen. They also revealed that her construction costs had bankrupted the vessel's financier. Within a decade, it was clear to everyone that the Great Eastern was too big for her own good. Smaller, cheaper ships that didn't try to sail from England to Australia without stopping outcompeted her. She was also far too large to take advantage of the Suez Canal. As soon as that waterway opened in 1869, Brunel's Great Eastern transformed from a modern miracle into a dinosaur that had to sail around the southern tip of Africa like it was still the 16th century. Once she'd failed as a commercial vessel, the Great Eastern's owners repurposed her to lay the first transatlantic telegraph cable. In subsequent decades, she passed between unlucky buyers, none of whom could ever turn her to a profit. Because many of them left her moored for years on end, barnacles and mussels ate away her hull, which was too big to clean with any regularity. During the 1880s, she was repeatedly retailored as a floating concert hall, a pleasure palace, and an offshore billboard. Her chandeliers and balustrades and plush four-poster beds were sold off piecemeal. At last, she was scrapped in 1889. The Great Eastern was so large and difficult to disassemble that the workers tasked with taking her apart walked off the job. From her origins as a technological leap forward, Brunel's last project, his beloved Great Babe, had been reduced into a fossil and then finally a nuisance. Today, she's famous mostly as a monument to hubris. Dismantled ships bookend the Victorian era. Whereas the Great Eastern was scrapped near the end of the period, the HMS Temeraire was scrapped near the beginning. The Temeraire had been a 98-gun wooden warship that had fought against Napoleon during the Battle of Trafalgar, the most celebrated naval victory in British history. By the 1830s, the old ship was obsolete, so Britain's Admiralty commanded her to be destroyed. In 1838, J.M.W. Turner portrayed her final journey in a painting called The Fighting Temeraire, which shows a small, steam-powered tugboat pulling the massive battleship along the Thames. The Temeraire, a ghostly white ship glowing with light, towers on the left-hand side of Turner's canvas. Because her sails are lowered, she looks skeletal, like the legendary Flying Dutchman. The tugboat occupies the painting's center. It's a squat black shape whose chimney, an assertive rectangle, belches filthy smoke that looks like hellfire. On the right side of the canvas is a mournful sunset painted in purple and orange. Near the viewer, in the right-hand foreground, a harbor full of flotsam welcomes the Temeraire into a gloomy scrapyard. Turner resented the destruction of a national symbol that he felt worthy of respect and even reverence. According to the Victorian art critic John Ruskin, the Fighting Temeraire has an autobiographical agenda. It unconsciously illustrates the artist's life in its decline. Ruskin's claim aligns the aging Turner with the Temeraire. Both are tragic figures out of place in modern Britain, which fails to treasure and preserve its cultural heritage. Whatever we think about Ruskin's analysis, there's no doubt that the Fighting Temeraire is visually and thematically clearer than the other Turner paintings we've discussed throughout this series. For instance, the Temeraire isn't allowed to hoist the Union Jack, but the tugboat dragging her toward destruction is proudly flying the flag of a private corporation. In case the message wasn't obvious enough, the sun is also literally setting on an emblem of the British Empire's former glory. The Fighting Temeraire's clear, patriotic narrative transformed it into an immediate success. Early press reviews hailed the painting as a grand image. The novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, who ridiculed rain, steam, and speed, approvingly remarked that the Fighting Temeraire makes you see and think of a great deal more than the objects before you. It can soothe or intoxicate, fire or depress. He compared the painting to music by Ludwig van Beethoven. Turner himself called the Fighting Temeraire his darling, and he refused all private buyers' offers to purchase it. After his death, the canvas entered the collection of the National Gallery, which has cherished and displayed it ever since. In 2005, the Fighting Temeraire was voted Britain's favorite painting. In 2012, it appeared in the James Bond film Skyfall, where it symbolized a hero hated by a country that wrongly believes itself to have outgrown him. At last, in 2020, Turner's painting adorned British banknotes. Appropriately, the doomed ship appeared on currency after the 2016 Brexit referendum kneecapped the British economy and forced the nation to contend with the fact that it was no longer a major world power. Today, an atmosphere of tragedy or loss often clouds discussions of the country's future. For opposing reasons, old and young, rich and poor often fear that Britain, like the Temeraire, is on its final journey toward the scrapyard. In the conclusion to this episode, I'll discuss what industrialization and enclosure look like in the 21st century. Since the 1970s and 80s, a new mode of what the academic David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession has rolled across the world with almost no constraints. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common. But, as we learned in 1991, 2008, and 2020, it lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Conclusion: land grabbing on a great scale. Industrialization and enclosure are not discrete historical or geographical events. They began in England several centuries ago, but since that time, they've become ongoing processes with world historical significance. According to the historian Eric Hobsbawm, it's senseless to ask when the Industrial Revolution was complete, for its essence was that henceforth, revolutionary change became the norm. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels proposed something similar in 1848. Under capitalism, they asserted, all fixed, fast-frozen relations are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. Throughout the 19th century, industrial capitalism's limitless appetite for resources drove it to devour new lands. Motivated by the fantasy of endless growth, and driven by steam power, imperial conquest accelerated until, by the dawn of the 20th century, nearly the entire planet had been drawn into a single economic and political system. Every place was capitalist. Every place was colonized. Since that point in history, anti-capitalist or anti-industrial movements have often dovetailed with protests for environmental justice or indigenous rights. Many of these protests have attempted to restore a long-lost historical utopia defined by a traditional economy and way of life. Despite their moral authority, none of these protests have ever meaningfully challenged the long-term stability or power of the capitalist world order. All of them have been essentially nostalgic for a vanquished past. In contrast, wherever genuine, existential challenges to the global capitalist order have arisen, they've been future-facing, and they've prioritized rapid industrialization. Without economic development, revolutionary movements can't survive the blockades and invasions orchestrated by a hostile counter-revolutionary order. In 10 years at most, warned Joseph Stalin, we must make good the distance that separates us from the advanced capitalist countries. 9 years after his pronouncement, Nazi Germany invaded the USSR. In the years since World War II, the old imperial core has gradually decolonized and deindustrialized. All the while, it has offshored its productive industries onto developing countries, many of which remain in economic bondage despite enjoying nominal independence. The post-war system of financial imperialism has allowed the familiar process of enclosure, or accumulation by dispossession, to proceed as aggressively as ever. Since the 1970s and 80s, a neoliberal orthodoxy that took shape in the United States and Britain has systematically assailed the global commons. Public goods, like land, water, and mineral resources, have been privatized. Public services, including healthcare and education, have been dismantled and sold to the highest bidder. Stock buybacks, mergers, acquisitions, and agency capture have been utilized as weapons of the credit system and of finance capital. All the while, the governments of wealthy states have coordinated to orchestrate and manage crises that create investment opportunities. Sometimes, this means war in Iraq or Ukraine. Sometimes, it means economic subsidies or bailouts that transfer taxpayer money to private companies like Tesla or Goldman Sachs. International financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF enforce austerity programs and debt restructuring to strip poor countries of their assets. Meanwhile, in cyberspace, we're witnessing a new form of digital enclosure. Ultra-wealthy corporations are devouring the carcass of a free and open internet before our eyes. Even our browsing habits have become commodities that can be strip-mined and sold off for profit. If we're truly going to inaugurate an equitable or an environmentally sustainable future, then we need to transcend mere nostalgia for traditional ways of life that have been made extinct. We need to come to terms with the reality that controlled industrial development improves the quality of many people's lives. Finally, we need to remember that the accumulation of capital is inherently a violent process that depends on dispossession. I swallowed a moon made of iron. They refer to it as a nail. I swallowed this industrial sewage, these unemployment documents. Youth stooped at machines die before their time. I swallowed the hustle and the destitution, swallowed pedestrian bridges, life covered in rust. I can't swallow anymore. All that I've swallowed is now gushing out of my throat, unfurling upon the land of my ancestors into this disgraceful poem. The author of that piece was Xu Lizhi, a Chinese laborer born in 1990. He worked in a factory in Shenzhen. He manufactured iPhones, PlayStations, and Kindles. He lived in an apartment room of 10 square meters, cramped and damp, with no sunlight all year long. He committed suicide at 24 years old. In this episode, we surveyed industrialization from an economic point of view. Next time, we'll approach it from a cultural and political perspective by zooming in on the most dire decade of the 19th century, Britain's Hungry 40s. Along the way, we'll study the radical working-class movement called Chartism, meet the demon barber Sweeney Todd, ask why political novels have heroines, and spend Christmas Eve with Ebenezer Scrooge. I'm Brian Reinken. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting into Air. If you enjoy this show, please leave a comment and rate us on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about this episode, you can visit our website at meltingintoair.net, where we've posted show notes, artwork, and a movie list. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please visit our Patreon for exclusive content and other membership benefits. You can always reach us at info@meltingintoair.net. This is Brian Reinken. See you in episode 6.